The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is a vast and unforgiving expanse, defined by unending conflict and the desperate struggle for survival. Humanity's Imperium, clinging to existence amidst a tide of enemies, could scarcely imagine a greater upheaval than the return of the Primarchs, the legendary progenitors of the Space Marine legions. These beings, crafted by the Emperor himself, are more than warriors. They are symbols of hope, ambition, and power, as well as harbingers of inevitable turmoil. If the Primarchs returned today, the repercussions would be felt across every corner of the galaxy. Roboute Guilliman's recent reemergence has already shown how the revival of even one of these figures can reshape the Imperium. Guilliman's resurrection has brought reform and military revival, with the Indomitus Crusade reclaiming vast swaths of lost territory. But Guilliman's burden is immense. He stands alone among his brothers, straining to uphold the Emperor's vision in a time of desperation. The sudden return of his fellow Primarchs would change everything, for better or worse. The loyalist Primarchs, if they rejoined the Imperium, would bring unparalleled strength and leadership. Each of these figures embodied unique qualities, and their abilities could address some of the Imperium's most critical challenges. Rogel Dorn, the master of fortifications, could reinforce the defenses of Terra itself, ensuring that no enemy could breach the throne world's bastions. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, whose unrelenting ferocity in battle once defined the Space Wolves, could spearhead brutal campaigns into the heart of chaos-held space, threatening the very existence of the Traitor legions. Vulcan, the ever-resilient blacksmith and protector, might reignite compassion and humanity in a society grown cold and oppressive under the weight of war. The Lion, a knightly figure of unparalleled martial skill and strategy, could bolster the Imperium's armies while wrestling with the shadowed history of the Dark Angels. But such a resurgence would not come without conflict. These Primarchs, forged in the fires of the Great Crusade, would not recognize the Imperium they once fought to build. To many of them, the current state of humanity would seem like a horrifying mockery of the Emperor's vision. The worship of the Emperor as a god central to the ecclesiarchy's grip on the populace would clash bitterly with the atheistic beliefs of several Primarchs, especially Guilliman and Dorn. This ideological chasm could lead to schisms within the Imperium, as factions loyal to the returning Primarchs challenge the entrenched dogmas of the Adeptus Ministorum. And what of the traitor Primarchs, the once loyal sons who betrayed the Emperor and now serve the Chaos Gods? If they returned, their presence would escalate the galactic conflict to apocalyptic levels. Ongron, driven by an insatiable, berserk rage, would become an unstoppable engine of destruction, carving a bloody path through countless worlds. Fulgrim, corrupted by Slaanesh, would spread decadence and corruption wherever he went, leaving entire systems in ruin. Mortar Ion, the Plague Lord, would unleash unimaginable diseases and despair, turning entire sectors into fetid wastelands. The very existence of these fallen Primarchs would reignite the horrors of the Horus heresy on a scale unseen for millennia. Perhaps most chilling of all would be the potential return of Horus himself, should the Chaos Gods will it. While Abaddon the Despoiler has long carried the banner of chaos, Horus remains an unmatched figure of charisma and strategic genius. His return would unite the fractured forces of chaos into a single, terrifying juggernaut, and even the most steadfast defenders of the Imperium would falter before his might. The reappearance of the traitor Primarchs, alongside their loyalist counterparts, would signal a galactic conflagration that might finally extinguish humanity's flame. Beyond the obvious military consequences, the return of the Primarchs would send ripples through the entire Imperium. The Space Marine chapters, long accustomed to independence and self-determination, would find themselves torn between their established traditions and the will of their progenitors. The Blood Angels, for example, might face an existential crisis if Sanguinius, their long-lost Primarch, reappeared. Would they embrace his leadership unconditionally? Or would the millennia-long struggle against the Black Rage make them wary of abandoning the identities they have forged in his absence? Similar tensions would arise among the Ultramarines, Raven Guard, and other chapters, as their Primarchs either embraced or rejected the paths their descendants have taken. The political landscape of the Imperium would also face upheaval. The High Lords of Terra, who have wielded near-absolute authority in the Emperor's name, would see their power challenged by the Primarchs' return. These figures, imbued with unparalleled legitimacy, could override decrees, demand loyalty from Imperial forces, and reshape entire sectors. Such an event would threaten the delicate balance of power that has allowed the Imperium to function, creating the potential for internal conflict and rebellion. Even the Inquisition, an institution dedicated to rooting out heresy, would be forced to grapple with the contradictions posed by the Primarchs, whose authority might bypass even their own. The wider galaxy would not stand idle in the face of such monumental change. The alien races, already locked in struggle against the Imperium, would respond with equal parts fear and opportunity. The Necrons, ever watchful and calculating, might accelerate their plans to reclaim the galaxy, viewing the Primarchs as a threat to their ancient dynasties. The Eldar, haunted by their fragmented prophecies, could see the resurgence of the Primarchs as a double-edged sword, either assisting them in their gambits or unleashing dire consequences for their people. Even the Tyranids, driven by an instinctual hunger for biomass, might adapt their strategies, targeting the Primarchs as high-value prey in their relentless invasion. Amidst these shifting tides, the Primarchs themselves would struggle to reconcile their identities with the galaxy they have returned to. For those loyal to the Emperor, the weight of their father's expectations and the reality of his crippled state would be a bitter burden. Guilliman has already expressed his frustration and despair at the Emperor's silence, and his brothers might share in that existential unease. For the traitors, centuries of service to the Chaos Gods would have transformed them into entities scarcely recognizable as the men they once were. Their motivations, whether driven by hatred, ambition, or madness, would only exacerbate the chaos they unleash. Ultimately, the return of the Primarchs would be both a blessing and a curse for the galaxy. Their unparalleled power and leadership could bring humanity back from the brink of extinction, uniting it against the countless threats that assail it. Yet, their return would also magnify the divisions within the Imperium, turning long-standing cracks into gaping chasms. Whether the Primarchs became saviors, destroyers, or something in between, one thing would remain certain. Their presence would irrevocably alter the fate of the galaxy for millennia to come. The resurgence of the Primarchs would not just be a tale of glory and conflict. It would force every institution of the Imperium and every individual within it to confront hard truths. The Space Marines, once united under the banner of their Primarchs, have splintered into independent chapters over 10,000 years. While they share genetic heritage, each chapter has evolved its own traditions, cultures, and interpretations of their duty to the Imperium. The return of their Primarchs would create a wave of soul-searching and potentially devastating divisions. Take the Space Wolves, for example. Leman Russ, their fiery and independent leader, embodied the values of his chapter, a blend of savage loyalty and disdain for authority. His return could either galvanize the chapter into becoming an unstoppable force or destabilize them, as his fiery temper clashed with the modern pragmatism that centuries of survival have demanded. Similarly, the Ultramarines would face the challenge of reconciling Guilliman's modern vision with their current practices. Would they adhere to his Codex Astartes, a document they hold sacred, or follow him in the deviations that his return has demanded for the Imperium's survival? For the Blood Angels, the stakes would be uniquely personal. If Sanguinius were somehow resurrected or returned, his presence might offer salvation from the genetic curse of the Black Rage that plagues his sons. Yet it would also unearth old wounds, the trauma of his sacrifice during the Horus Heresy and the failure of the Imperium to honor his legacy in a manner befitting such a sacrifice. Would his return heal their fractured psyche or amplify the tragedy of their existence, making the curse all the more unbearable? Beyond the Space Marines, the return of the Primarchs would ignite chaos in the Imperium's civilian population. To most humans in the Imperium, the Primarchs are mythical figures, akin to angels or demigods from ancient fables. Their reappearance would either reaffirm the faith of billions or challenge the very foundation of Imperial worship. How would a devout population react to Rogel Dorn or Guilliman denouncing the Ecclesiarchy's god worship as heretical? Would the common people revolt against the religious establishment, or would they turn on the Primarchs themselves, declaring them impostors or blasphemers? The Inquisition, one of the most powerful and secretive organizations in the Imperium, would be thrown into unprecedented turmoil. Many inquisitors operate under the assumption that the Emperor's word, as interpreted through the High Lords of Terra and the Ecclesiarchy, is absolute. The return of the Primarchs would present them with figures of unquestionable authority, potentially invalidating much of their existing structure. Some inquisitors would undoubtedly pledge themselves to the Primarchs, while others, seeing them as a destabilizing force, might attempt to oppose them. This schism within the Inquisition would likely result in widespread purges and shadow wars, further destabilizing the Imperium at a time when unity is desperately needed. Meanwhile, in the Eye of Terror, the traitor Primarchs would revel in their newfound opportunity. The Chaos Gods, sensing the surge of tension and psychic energy throughout the galaxy, would unleash their full power to tip the balance in their favor. Mortarion might lead the Death Guard in a campaign to turn entire Imperial sectors into diseased wastelands. Fulgrim, with his seductive allure, could infiltrate Imperial nobility and subvert the populace from within. Ongran would likely reappear at the head of a massive World Eater's warband, his bloodlust driving him to shatter entire crusades in brutal close combat. The traitor's mere presence would embolden chaos-aligned forces, uniting warring factions and smaller warbands under the banners of their dread lords. The galaxy's Xenos races, too, would adjust their strategies in response to the Primarchs' return. The Tau Empire, despite their optimism and diplomatic tendencies, would find themselves unable to resist the renewed fervor of the Imperium's campaigns. The Tyranids, drawn by the psychic resonance of the Primarchs, would descend on humanity in even greater numbers, forcing the Imperium into battles of apocalyptic scale. The Orcs, ever eager for a good fight, would flock to the conflict zones, seeing the Primarchs as the ultimate challenge for their warlike nature. The Eldar, perhaps the most complicated of all, might view the Primarchs with a mix of fear and hope. Their cryptic prophecies could suggest that the return of these figures might either delay the birth of Slaaneish's successor or accelerate it, leading to a desperate gamble on their part. Yet, for all the potential power and influence of the Primarchs, their return would also raise profound questions about their limitations. These beings, while extraordinary, are not infallible. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is far harsher and more fragmented than the one they once knew. The resources they relied upon during the Great Crusade, the unity of the Imperium, the boundless supply chains of Mars, the seemingly endless legions of the Imperial army, are no longer available. The Primarchs, for all their brilliance, would need to adapt to a galaxy where every decision carries staggering consequences. In the end, the return of the Primarchs would transform the Imperium into a new and chaotic entity. They would inspire hope among the faithful, reignite the flames of rebellion among the disillusioned, and unleash unparalleled levels of conflict. Their presence might offer the chance for humanity's ultimate redemption or hasten its final doom. One thing is certain. In a galaxy defined by endless war and suffering, the return of the Primarchs would not bring peace. It would bring fire, blood, and change on a scale that even the Emperor himself could not have foreseen.